All right, so general coding guidelines of ICD-10-CM. Let's start. Coding conventions versus coding guidelines. The conventions, general guidelines, and chapter-specific guidelines are applicable to all healthcare settings unless otherwise indicated. The conventions and instructions of the classification take precedence over guidelines. I mentioned to you the difference between the coding conventions and the general coding guidelines. And I did specifically say that the conventions actually supersedes the general coding guidelines. And the conventions that I showed you guys are those examples that when you go to the tabular, there are specific instructions under a category code, sometimes in the subcategory code. But what I'm trying to say is that when you're assigning the code, okay, you want to make sure that you also check other instructions that are in that, in that category, because they're important. They may be applicable to all subcategory codes. The example that we used last night was diabetes, right? So we went to diabetes, we went to the E11, which is the category code, right? You guys remember what I told you last night? The first three characters of a code, like for diabetes, the first three character is a category code, meaning that when you see instructions under, like this one is type 2 diabetes, type 2 DM, right? So under a type 2 DM, you're going to see a lot of instructions here. Okay. The one that we saw was a tab that says includes, right? And there are other instructions that are in red print or red font, right? So those are the instructional notes. Okay. So that is an example of a coding convention. Convention is not an assembly of people, guys. So please remember that, okay? It's not an assembly of people or assembly of delegations. It is they are actually regulations. They are rules. Okay? So, again, guys, like what I mentioned last night, the conventions, the coding conventions always supersedes the general coding guidelines, which we will be also covering in our next discussions. Now, let me show you guys what these conventions are. Last night, again, I showed you this, right? I had you guys open your book. By the way, those who don't. All right, so you have already learned, guys, the different parts of the book, right? The index and the tabular. Now, when you talk about conventions right here, I'll show you some examples of the conventions. Look here, the E11, the one I just wrote on the board right here, okay? Think about when you go to the tabular, guys, when you go to the tabular, this is how it looks. It may look different in your book, but some other coding assisted or computer assisted coding portals may show this type of structure. So E11 is a type 2 diabetes mellitus, right? This guy's here, you see this includes right here. It's the same in your tabular. You will see this includes diabetes mellitus due to insulin secretory defect, diabetes NOS, and insulin resistant diabetes. So every single one of these guys are actually part of the type 2 diabetes mellitus. So this is what this convention is about. This one is a convention to use additional code. This one is a convention to excludes one. Okay, those are conventions that you should not ignore when you are assigning the code. And we're going to be covering these different conventions in our in the succeeding slides. Okay, now in the index, we're talking about the tabular here. Okay, in the alphabetic index right here, a convention could be an instruction that says see also. That is a convention. Okay, a convention can also be a manifestation like this one. F02.80 is a manifestation of this code right here. Okay, so this code right here, F0280, this is actually a dementia code of a patient who is having an Alzheimer's, or a patient who has Alzheimer's automatically also is also demented, or suffering from dementia. And this is the reason why if you assign this code G30.9, a convention says you need to assign the F0280 as well, because if a patient has Alzheimer's, that also means to say that patient also has dementia. Okay, so these are conventions right here, because this bracket here shows you that Alzheimer's, this is the Alzheimer's code, also has, has a manifestation that it's called dementia. All right, so that's what conventions mean. Any question, guys, so far? So when you talk about conventions, you're talking about this little instructions or additional instructions that you can find in the alphabetic index and also in the tabular. Again, the reason why I always ask you guys that when you look for the code, start with the alphabetic index and you make sure that you validate that code, check in the tabular if that code is final, because the tabular may give you additional instruction on what to do with that code. One example, Rhodia brought it up last night, and she had a good point when she said, hey, how come, the systolic heart failure code is different from what she found, and what what the other you guys also have selected, right? So there is a convention that tells, that gives an instruction saying that you have to make sure to check this final code right here. Okay, don't settle with that code because that is incomplete. You have to check the complete characters in order for you to assign that code as valid. Okay, so that's what these conventions are. Again, guys, conventions are like a hard and fast rule in coding. You have to follow it. You have to abide or adhere to those coding conventions. Okay, so next up, let's read here. The alphabetic index and tabular list. Okay. The ICD-10-CM is divided into alphabetic index, an alphabetical list of terms and their correspondence code, and the tabular list. A structured list of codes divided into chapters based on the body system or condition. The alphabetic index consists of the following parts. Okay, the index, diseases, and injury in the index of external causes of injury, the table of neoplasm, and the table of drugs and chemicals. Now, these instruction here, guys, we have when we started our meeting the first time, right? The first time, I explained to you guys what these book is comprised with, right? So this basically an instruction or just an information saying that the book that you guys are using right now is divided into this major, major sections like the alphabetic index and the tabular. And it basically explains that the index, the alphabetic index consists of different parts as well, like, the names of diseases or the terms of the diseases, the table of neoplasm or cancer, the table of drugs and chemicals, and the external causes of injury. Okay, so those are the major parts of the alphabetic index. And the tabular is another portion of the book where you are to check the validity of the code, under these rules, which we have already mentioned about coding conventions. Okay. Let's continue. Format and structure. The ICD-10-CM tabular list contains categories, subcategories, and codes. Characters for categories, subcategories, and codes may be either a letter or a number. All categories are 3 characters. A 3-character category that has no further division is equivalent to a code. Subcategories are either 4 or 5 characters, and codes may be 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 characters. That is, each level of subdivision after a category is a subcategory. The final level of subdivision is a code. Codes that have applicable 7 characters are still referred to as codes, not subcategories. A code that has an applicable 7 character is considered invalid without the 7 characters. So we're going to be talking about more of these 7 character guys, but let me just summarize this long narrative here saying that the structure of the ICD-10-CM can be 3 to 7 character long. I have already told you guys that the first 3 characters is called category code. A reason why you need to understand that category from subcategory, because the category code, guys, most of the time there are many instructions that are encapsulated or that are under the that are under the category code that you need to follow when you're assigning codes. When you're assigning codes in that specific category. Again, I use this E11 type 2 DM, okay? There is an instruction that says, let's go to your E11 code, guys. Everybody please go to your book and let's go to the E11 so you will clearly understand what I meant about categories and subcategory, okay? So this is your type 2 DM. And I'll go to that page also. And I'm talking about your tabular, E11 type 2 diabetes mellitus. All right, so I have already explained to you guys that those instructions, under that are called conventions. I want you to pay attention specifically to the instructions in red font, in red print. And what are those instructions? It says, use additional code. And let's use the red print. Use additional code to identify, control, right? Or what? Using, okay? You have the insulin here. You have, what else? You have the oral hypoglycemic, right? And I think injectable or oral anti-diabetic. Okay, so here is this instruction was all about. Now, we now know that this is a category code, right? Okay. All codes that are under this, guys, by the way, E11 is not a complete code, right? All codes under E11 are called subcategory. So it started with what is the first code, guys, after E11? Okay. The first valid code is E11.00, right? That's the first valid code because why is that again? Because of that icon that says check, then fifth, right? So the E11.0 is not even a valid code because there are only 4 characters. There is an additional instruction saying, hey, check the fifth character because that's the valid code. So E11.00 is your first valid code. You have here E11.00. If you are to assign this code, guys, say you were reviewing the patient's chart, and you figured, okay, you decided that the patient has this condition. Okay, what is that condition? Type 2 diabetes mellitus with hyperosmolarity. Okay, with hyperosmolarity, meaning very, very concentrated, in that the patient's I guess, the cellular level, okay? Now, the E11.00 is a valid code. You assign this, but you are also to assign using the instruction here that says use additional code to identify control using if a patient is insulin or a patient is taking metformin or Januvia or Jardiance, whatever that patient is on, the diabetic medication the patient is on, you have to assign additional code for that. Meaning that all the codes here, if you are to assign other diabetic code, E1136, I think this is a cataract code. E1122, this is your diabetic CKD. Every time you assign a code like this, guys, you are also to assign the drug code here if a patient is taking them. Does that make sense? So the instruction that says the difference between the category over subcategory, these are subcategories, by the way. Okay? So all of these, the fact that this instruction, this convention is immediately under the E11, that means to say all category codes now have this instruction. Making sense? So Gian is asking, so if patient is taking both insulin and per ORM or oral medication, we put 2 codes. Absolutely correct, Gian. If a patient is on insulin and at the same time is on metformin, you are to assign both. Okay? So that's how you do it. That's a good question. So, I mean, there is a good reason why these instructions are put here, because all of these guys carry these instructions. Not unless when you see a subcategory code and there is an instruction that says do not assign, then you do not assign, right? But for diabetes, I don't think that there is an exception. All subcategory codes here, if a patient is on particular diabetic drug, you are to assign a code for that diabetic drug. Make sense? That's the reason why, guys, it is important that you understand the difference between category and subcategory. Okay, as what is being instructed here, you are actually, reason why this format and structure here is explained to you in detail because of that reason. They don't want you to miss these conventions or these rules, these regulations, because again, the subcategory codes right here carry the instructions from these 3 characters right here. Okay? And again, one of these statements here said, codes that have applicable 7 characters are still referred to as codes, not subcategories. A code that has an applicable 7 character is considered invalid without the 7 character, which means that if a code demands a 7 character, guys, there are quite few or many of these codes need a 7 character. Not all codes are 7 character long. Please remember that, okay? So, the ICD-10-CM guys, you know, when we were starting when this newly implemented, we were starting to study this. We thought that, you know, it's going to be really a very complex system, because coming from ICD-9 before, we only had 5 characters the most. When we transitioned to ICD-10, this was most coders fear that, you know, it's going to be more complex. But you will find out, guys, that the expansion of the code from 3 to 7 characters actually is a good concept. It's actually an easy concept to understand. Okay, now let's move on. Use of codes for reporting purposes. For reporting purposes, only codes are permissible, not categories or subcategories, and any applicable 7-character is required, which means that when you're reporting a code, guys, do not settle with subcategories if the code demands, you know, more more expansion. Like, again, I want to bring up Rodi's question last night. You know, getting the systolic heart failure, only 4-character code was reflected in the tabular without that instruction saying you have to get into the 5th character, right? You have to assign a code that is 5 characters long in order for this to become valid. This instruction says you can only assign a code, not the subcategory, not a category. If a category is not a final code, do not assign that for reporting purpose. So you want to make sure that when you're submitting the code, it is the final code, not the subcategory or a category, if it requires that final expansion.